Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the last panel, but not the least one, of course, of the conference, which is about cyber conflicts and cybersecurity. My name is Amit Sheniak from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem Cybersecurity Research Center, and also the Federman School for Public Policy and Government. And I will be chairing this session. Before we start, I think one cannot not address the fact that tomorrow is the U.S. presidential election. And I thought I'll start with a quote that reflects the different perception of cyber by former presidents and the current administration. In 2016, in the Cybersecurity National Action Plan by the Obama administration, and I quote, they addressed cybersecurity goals this way: just as our roads and bridges need regular repair and upkeep, so do the technical linkage that allow the information superhighway to flow. In the current administration, the Clean Network Initiative that was launched on this August, and I quote, it was said that an internet network which will be rooted in internationally accepted digital trust standards that will allow to assess the trustworthiness of telecommunication equipment suppliers is needed. I think those are two examples of the different changes and the conceptions of cybersecurity and cybersecurity governance in general. We are in an age today that we can research and reflect more historically and comparatively about this issue, and the four papers that we are interesting papers that we are going to hear about do exactly that. I would like to briefly present the participants and the titles of their papers before we all carry on. So we'll start with Stefania Grottola from the Global Studies Institute of Geneva. That will present a paper addressing the limitation of multilateral norms processes to include private sector norms, initiatives and stakeholders. We will carry on by a paper presented by Milton Mueller and Karl Grindal from Georgia Institute of Technology School of Public Policy that will describe the consequences of securitization of social media through the lens of U.S. information operation doctrine. We will move later to a paper by Rolf H that will talk about and will assess the possible contribution of international legal concept to the governance of cybersecurity. And we'll conclude with a paper presented by Sadie Creese, William Dutton, Patricia Esteve-Gonzalez from Oxford, and Ruth Shillair from Michigan State University, assessing the value in supporting the investment in capacity building, cybersecurity capacity building of states using a very wide national comparative analysis. So without further ado, let us start with the first paper. And I remind all of you to write your questions in the chat so they can be addressed in the chat or orally at the end of the presentations. Thanks.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. The paper I will present today focuses on the proliferation of cyber norms advanced by traditional and non-traditional actors, and wonder what this abundance means for existing institutionalized processes. When it comes to norms for responsible behavior in cyberspace, we're all familiar with the milestone achievements reached by the UN group of governmental experts in 2013 and 2015. The first report states that international law applies to cyberspace, while the second one proposes a set of voluntary norms, principles, and capacity building measures. While the consensus-based approach of these reports was seen as an achievement, some concerns emerged with regard to the effectiveness of these voluntary norms, as well as with regards to the dangers that not agreeing to how exactly international law applies can bring, especially when discussing the resort to traditional military means of warfare. So as of 2015, what we have seen is the failure of approval of UNGG reports and the creation of an additional group, which is the open-ended working group, with a mandate that largely overlaps with UNGG in one, and a structure that shows an institutional process that risks to be a bit gridlocked. So if this is the situation from the institutional point of view, then we can see that there have been a lot of developments and initiatives being proposed by non-state actors and especially private sector and multi-stakeholder initiatives. And just to name some of them, we have the Commission on the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace proposing the Singapore norm package with the very important norm of protecting the public or the internet. We have Microsoft advancing the Digital Geneva Convention, the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, the Digital Peace Campaign now. Then we have Siemens with the Charter of Trust and Google with the new legal framework for the cloud area. So inevitably, we can see that we have many proposals being advanced. And so the entire push for this paper came from an experience that I had exactly a year ago. A year ago at the IGF in Berlin. I was walking out from an event organized by the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, presenting its report. And then I went into a workshop discussing cyberconflict and responsible behavior. And we were supposed to discuss cyber norms without even defining what cyber norms are. And then the question that I had in the back of my mind for the entire discussion was which set of, so inevitably, I hope you can still hear me well.
We can hear you.
So inevitably we have, okay, sorry, I had a note from Zoom. So inevitably we can see that there is a lot of confusion. There can be a lot of confusion, and the question is, why do we have all these actors proposing these norms? And so and why these actors always involved in institutionalized? Because we can see that and so this all led to the research question for this paper, which is, what does the abundance of cyber norms by multi-stakeholder intermediaries show about the limitations of existing institutional processes? So previously, I mentioned the private sector multi-stakeholder initiatives advancing norms, and so being in a position of norm entrepreneurship. And if we have to discuss norm entrepreneurship, I believe that a reference to the multi-stakeholder participation in internet governance is necessary. Of course, the enlargement of actors in the discussion does not necessarily reflect a diffusion in political authority, but we see that the more stakeholders while we have more stakeholders participating in the discussion, then also we see that there is a shift from hard law implementation to soft law mechanisms, which gives the room to new actors to propose new norms, to advance new principles and norms for behavior. For responsible behavior in cyberspace. And also, if we look at the cycle of a norm, we can see that only states are in the position to internationalize a norm. But it's also true that we haven't seen this since 2015, and that private sector and again multi-stakeholder initiatives have been advancing new norms, and so they have been at the first and second stage of a cycle, which is the emergence and the cascade effect of these new norms. So inevitably, we see that the role of the private sector and the private sector, civil society, and multi-stakeholder initiative is crucial. And if we have to contextualize this into a theoretical context, we can use the theory which is the backbone of this paper, which is the orchestration intermediary theory. And so we see the states as orchestrators in order to achieve the target of governing responsible behavior in cyberspace need some intermediaries, which again are the actors and the stakeholders just mentioned. And so, so this is the framework of the research paper. We now get into the more methodological part of it. the paper tries to understand if there is an abundance of norms, and if so, why is that? So we have compared purposes samples of cyber norms, and we have compared them with UNGG reports of 2015, and we have rationalized the abundance of cyber norms through two indicators. The first one is the multiplicity of different norms. And so in other words, the existence of more than one norm for the same aim or outcome. And the second one is the nature of the initiative and outcomes. And so this nature can be categorized into three sort of norms. We have reiterative norms, which highlight the importance of recalling approved norms in setting a for the ability and efficiency of existing processes in developing how actually the consensus norms can be improved and can be actually operationalized. And finally, we have the supplementary norms, which stress the need to cover aspects that are not part of the agenda right now. And so primary results have shown that the abundance does not only exist, but by looking at the nature of these norms, we can identify three levels of political engagement. The first of political engagement is given by the nature of the norms, and if you see, and we can see non-traditional, non-state reiterated proposals, and tend to take a role that is not just as intermediaries, but most likely as orchestrators. Of course, this is just a preliminary approach, but we can see this with more research. The complementary nature of the norms approach introduces the second level of political engagement, and we see that at this stage, non-state actors actually can bring in the resources, the expertise, and the hands-on experience to actually see how a norm can be actually operationalized. And finally, we have the supplementary nature of the norms, which strengthens the need to cover aspects that are not part of the agenda, either because are too new or, sorry, can you still hear me? I hope so. Or because they might be controversial. And the clearest example, going back to your introductory remarks, is the protection of the electoral infrastructure now more than ever. So after this, we can draw two. The inclusion of stakeholders is not. The inclusion of stakeholders can be discussed further, especially on how this can be effectively done. And so and then also another reflection from this paper is that we have an abundance of cyber. The fewer proposals and processes could actually facilitate in keeping track of the developments and the. By this, I do not mean to minimize the work of experts and professionals, as their expertise and that we need. There could be a track in which all the proposals are gathered, they are discussed, and then there might be a proposal of one or more outcome, and this could be actually easier for researchers, but most importantly for governmental experts to just have a look at the few outcomes rather than decide which one to take care of. And finally, another proposal that I advanced in the paper is the one to make use of the recently appointed tech ambassadors, tech and cyber ambassadors. Of course, you cannot change the international process. You cannot change the international institution. It's quite utopic and unrealistic. However, we have seen that there have been changes in the national institution. We have seen that countries are increasingly appointing cyber tech ambassadors with the role to bridge the gap between the policy development and mainly the tech sector. And so I see the role of tech ambassadors as bridging the gap between policy development and the tech sector, not only producing and providing the technology, but also advancing proposals and norms and responsible behavior. And so I'm not sure if I still have time, but I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefania, and exactly on time. Let us move to the next paper.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
All right, so I'm going to do the first part of this presentation. I'm Milton Mueller. I'm a professor at Georgia Tech, and we also run the Internet Governance Project there. And we're talking about information operations and taking a close look at the US evolution of information operations doctrine. I'm just going to introduce you to the sort of the underlying puzzles and questions that motivated this paper, and then I'm going to turn it over to Karl, who's going to present most of the paper. So in the aftermath of the influence operations of 2016, which is a very polarizing impact on the US electorate, there was a lot of claims that we were subjected to information warfare and that we were in an information war and that we needed to respond somehow. And I have always had some conceptual difficulty with the concept of information warfare, and particularly how it coexists with the notion of a liberal democracy when where you're supposed to have free expression in order to mediate and keep accountable the political system. And so if information is part of a war, if it's a weapon, that's a very problematic concept in a liberal democracy, and we need to investigate that. So we took a fairly focused approach. We said, what changes took place in US military organization, policy, doctrine, and practice, all very different things, and a very big thing it turned out to be. What changed after 2016, and can we see that exemplified in military doctrine documents? And the most important question was, are these changes eroding the distinction between liberal democratic political systems and authoritarian political systems? So let me turn it over to Karl now, and I will change the slides. Just tell me when to do it.
Thanks, Dr. Mueller. So drawing on those questions, the first of which looks at a more descriptive, qualitative and historical question of what changes are occurring to US military organizations, policy, doctrine, and practice, while the second part is more analytical in the direction these trends could result for free expression on the internet and the effect on political systems. So with the time I have, I'll summarize the approach, findings, and analysis we employ. Next. So as the impetus for this paper came out of Dr. Mueller's thinking about information operations with respect to his editorial work at the Cyber Defense Review, a journal of the Army Cyber Institute at West Point, we started with a military-centric question. And this targeted our scope of inquiry to the US military's operations. One consequence of this is that broadly the paper excludes from focus concurrent changes to the US State Department, Broadcasting Board of Governors, and US intelligence agencies, all of which would have their own changes or actions occurring concurrently with the military changes that we document. Where possible, we tried to be systematic in our search inquiry, identifying relevant documents from military publication databases, and then would identify those worth further review. As the US military is quite open about changes to organization, doctrine, and policy, these changes could be observed. However, changes to practice are generally classified. And so with respect to those, law, policy, doctrine, and organization, we can observe changes. Next. As changes to US military doctrine and policy were produced systematically, we could monitor these policy documents like the President's National Security Strategy and Congressional National Defense Authorization Acts, which allocate funds for the military, help to set strategic priorities by civilian oversight and occur on a regular basis. So those could be reviewed systematically. And then the DoD and Joint Chiefs produced DoD-wide instructions and manuals. Dr. Mueller, you're sharing our Slack. So while the DoD and Joint Chiefs produce DoD-wide instructions and manuals, the US service branches also develop their own independent doctrine. By compiling this, tracking relevant changes, we develop a narrative in the paper that documents these trends. We'll go to next slide when that's up and ready, on human domain and cyber domain distinction. Dr. Mueller, do you have the slides? Otherwise, I'll just continue. Yes, back up. Thank you. So the military frequently employs the language of domains of warfare. These operation domains include space, cyber, air, sea, and land. And some of the military would like to add a cognitive domain, which we refer to in the paper as the human domain. This language helps us to describe a historical distinction that is moving in the direction of being blurred. From a conceptual perspective, this can happen in instances like the DNC hack, where you had a cyber incident that then led to a strategic leak of documents, one of which would be in the cyber domain and another would be in the cognitive domain. But oftentimes the language of information can consume or subsume both domains and create confusion between the medium and the message. Next. So the US has a long history of information operations abroad, particularly as part of the United States Information Agency, which served to create a global media campaign against the countries of the communist bloc. Critical to our study is the history of SOCOM, though, Special Operations Command, which is a unified combatant command that oversees special operations. And that the Air Force defines as special operations, the Air Force defines as requiring unique modes of employment, tactical techniques, equipment, and training that often occur in hostile, denied, or politically sensitive environments. From the late 1980s to the early 1990s, both psychological operations and civil affairs were moved into special operations, and special operations sort of solidified their ownership of that activity. This produced a siloing of IO capabilities, excluding military intelligence, that continued through the post-Cold War environment and into the global war on terror. A notable trend under a separate conceptual category, cyber, occurred in the late 2000s, which culminated in the creation of Cyber Command, which is overseen by the dual-headed head of the National Security Administration. Next. So this timeline documents post-2016 a number of critical events that we identified. I'll just read some quotes that I think are pretty meaningful from some of the major strategies. The 2017 National Security Strategy states, America's competitors weaponize information to attack the values and institutions that underpin free societies while shielding themselves from outside information. The 2018 National Defense Strategy says counter-coercion and subversion in competition short of armed conflict, revisionist powers and rogue regimes are using corruption, predatory economic practices, propaganda, political subversion, proxies, and the threat of or use of military force. From the 2018 National Cyber Strategy, you have the United States will use all appropriate tools of national power to expose and counter the flood of online malign influence and information campaigns and non-state propaganda and disinformation. So these high-level policy documents really highlight the elevation of this as an issue of import. I'll shift to the next slide, jumping over some of the important organizational shifts just because we need to conclude. So our analysis identified a major trend where the domain is sort of shifting from an operational to a strategic focus, and then also a trend of greater integration of the concepts of cyber and IO capabilities. Drawing on those trends, we then looked at our second research question, next, where the notion of security dilemma becomes very important. A security dilemma describes a situation where the actions of a state taken to increase its own security lead to a reaction from other states to, and in the effect of that reaction, the net effect is it reduces the original state's security. We also identify a blurring of boundaries, particularly between the military and civilian spheres. Which brings us to a major concern and the relevance of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's Code of Conduct. In 2011, language was articulated by Russia and China describing information sovereignty as a desirable aim, using the language on the slide here. The US responded to that by saying the draft of Code of Conduct would legitimize the views, rights, right to freedom of expression can be limited by national laws and cultural proclivities, thereby undermining that right as described in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And we think that there's been a lot of drift between that articulation 6 to 8 years ago and the current articulation of US cyber policy doctrine strategy, or information policy doctrine strategy. And so paradoxically, this blurring of boundaries between war and peace, military and civilian, foreign and domestic, can push adherents of a information sovereignty doctrine to pose new national borders on internet exchanges and embrace national cyber norms that were previously rejected. With that, I'll conclude. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Let's move to the next paper, Rolf's paper.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Rolf Weber. I'm from Zurich, and my topic is Cybersecurity Governance as the first pillar and principles of international law as a second pillar. Perhaps I should start with a remark that I became interested in this topic in connection with the preparation of a paper together with Professor Joanna Kolesza from Poland, a well-known person in the GigaNet environment in the context of the research work of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Subsequently, I looked a little bit into cybersecurity matters in a narrow sense, became relatively frustrated. I will come back to that in a second. And I'm now moving forward to a much wider paper on integrity of internet, and somehow I would like to test water today with this interim paper, which you can download from the GigaNet website. I said that I became a little frustrated with cybersecurity in a narrow sense, because if we look at the various efforts which have been undertaken during the last couple of years, we have to realize that the result is almost zero, at least on a multilateral level. We do have some sectoral or segment-specific provisions, for example, in the law of the International Telecommunications Union and of the World Trade Organizations, but all the instruments which were envisaged to be achieved by the United Nations Group of Governmental Experts, the UNGGE, did not really realize. And perhaps I take now one sentence out of the fourth report, which gives me a bridge to my continuation of the presentation. And this is the sentence contained in the fourth report. I quote, "Obligations under international law are applicable to state use of ICTs, and states must comply with their obligations to respect and protect human rights and fundamental freedoms." So I think this is a very valuable sentence. I try now in the next couple of minutes to outline how we could better adhere to international legal concepts, i.e. to norms and policies which should be developed in order to enhance the global resilience, stability, and security of the internet on the basis of already developed or partly developed international legal concepts. And indeed, I do think that cybersecurity might be reasonably warranted if the international community is ready to accept some basic and common legal standards being applicable around the globe. The first concept which I address in my paper is the concept of global public goods, also not perfectly aligned to the needs of cybersecurity and the network's architecture. I do think that based on this concept, looking at or pursuing the common heritage of mankind, that some derivatives of public policy can be derived. There is a relatively broad understanding that the classical approach of international law based on sovereignty, and in particular based on consent-based structure and unanimity principle, will not survive in connection with the resilience and integrity of the internet. From an international law perspective, global public good theories are, by the way, not totally new. The idea of a certain communality already lies at the core of Roman law concepts such as jus cogens and erga omnes. Similarly, the concept of critical infrastructures and their protection can serve as another complementary point of reference. Then in addition, we do have the public interest concept, which is able to peremptorily impose binding obligations on states that have a similar foundation. Second pillar in this context is the concept of duty of cooperation, or the concept of shared spaces, being of course of critical importance in connection with infrastructure protection. The concept of shared spaces to be used by all states in a uniform, non-harmful way is also not new to the international community, and in international relations, many global legal areas constituting a law on international spaces have turned out to be relevant over time. I'm not in a position now to go into all details. I only refer, for example, to the law of the sea, to the law of space, or in particular outer space. If you look at the Treaty of 1976, you can see that the main purpose of this outer space treaty consists in the submission of all activities in outer space to international law, as well as in the principles of non-discrimination and of non-appropriation by any claim of sovereignty. And finally, amongst others, reference can be made to environmental law. So in other words, the basic principles being applicable in the mentioned areas of law, in particular also the notion of due diligence, can be made fruitful in respect of cybersecurity. Governance should closely cooperate in a continuing effort to arrive at an operable consensus. By the way, the Tallinn Manual 2.0 of NATO also refers to overarching international law, and particularly mentions two principles, namely state responsibility and due diligence. And this brings me now to the third concept, namely the concept of state responsibility. I will be short on that because already a lot has been said. Once an international obligation of a state is breached, be it an obligation of conduct or one of result, the consequences provided for in the law of the state responsibility entail. My main message in this context says that the responsibility principle should be more closely linked to the due diligence requirement, implying a state's duty to act with proper care in preventing a violation of international law. Indications of what is meant with due care in particular circumstances are to be derived from legal practice within individual areas of international relations. A particularly important document, in my opinion, is the OECD due diligence guidance for two reasons. First of all, this OECD due diligence guidance, having been published some 2 years ago, also includes non-state actors into the responsibility undertakings. And secondly, this document shows that a concretization of due diligence is indeed possible on paper as well as in real life, as the many proceedings of the national contact points of OECD show. The Global Commission on the Stability of the Cyberspace has mentioned a couple of additional principles, such as the requirement of restraint or the requirements to act principle, which I can only mention. This leads me then to the question, how can these international global standards be implemented? The first answer is, of course, a soft law, but we know that the legal quality of soft law and self-regulation is still a little bit doubtful, notwithstanding the fact that legal doctrine is of the opinion that the dichotomy between soft law and hard law should be overcome, and practice shows, for example, in connection with the work of the IETF and its requests for comments, that soft law does have an impact on the community. It could be strengthened by application of the so-called co-regulation model, which is often designed by a general framework established in the form of governmental regulations, which then is substantiated by the private sector. In other words, the state legislature sets the legal yardsticks and leaves the qualification of the given principles by way of specific rules to the private bodies. In this connection, I would like to make reference, for example, to the Council of Europe report of 2009 with the title Internet Governance and Critical Internet Resources. In a nutshell, I'm not going into the details of the European Union policies and the NIS directive. I come to the conclusion that good governance in connection with integrity and resilience of the internet is an objective that should eliminate, at least minimize risk caused by an inappropriate use of international electronic infrastructures. We can also have a look at the International Standardization Organization and its family norms 27,000. And by applying the mentioned global legal standards, a certain contribution could be paid to an improvement of cybersecurity governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And let us move to, last but not least, the paper.
Hello, I'm going to present the next paper. Thank you, Amit, for giving me the floor. If you give me a minute, I'm just going to share my screen. And just, yeah, I hope you can see it.
We can see.
Thank you. So I'm going to explain briefly this paper that has been done jointly with Sadie Creese, William Dutton, and Ruth Shillair. She is among the participants of this session today. now. Okay, so many governments and international organizations invest in cybersecurity building as cyber risk and cybersecurity has been grown in its importance in today's society. And these initiatives have a wide range of actions which approaches cybersecurity in very different disciplines, like it's not just technical, but as well implies laws, policies, education, etc. And moreover, these initiatives have different public objectives because the responsibility of cybersecurity and the risks of the cyberspace are not only in one particular strand of the society, but this responsibility involves a wide array of actors in all, local and all around the world. As there is little empirical research on whether all of these efforts achieve their objectives, this study asks if there is any empirical support for investing in capacity building. And to answer these questions, we use quantitative data from 73 countries that have been revised under the Cybersecurity Capacity Maturity Model of Nations, the CMM, that has been developed by the Oxford Cybersecurity Capacity Center. This data set hasn't been used yet in the literature, so this is another input that we add in the literature. So this, to know a bit what is the framework of the CMM, this maturity model I was mentioning, let me introduce it a bit. So the CMM is a framework that helps to gauge the maturity level of nations in different aspects of cybersecurity capacity building. In particular, it considers direct indicators on aspects in 5 dimensions of cybersecurity. These are policy and strategy aspects, cultural and societal aspects, aspects in education, training and skills, legal and regulatory frameworks of nations, and the technologies and standards in those nations. This data is collected using mixed research methods, and the data set consists in 47 ordinal variables and can take a value between 1 and 5, being 1 the minimum maturity level and 5 the highest one. Following the structure of the CMM, we calculate a weighted average of these 47 variables, and this average we call it cybersecurity capacity scale, and this is going to be our cybersecurity variable in our study. This variable is going to be continuous and can take any value between 1 and 5. And well, so we use this data for 73 nations. You can find more information about the methodologies used and any details of the paper in this link, where it is available, the paper, or in the program as well of the conference. It is worth to mention a bit which are these countries in our sample. So we have 73 nations that have not been selected randomly. So it makes, for example, to have a small proportion of high-income countries and a high representation of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, respect to other regions like Oceania. So having in mind this sample, I'm going to explain a bit our results and how we have used this unique data. Well, so this data allows us to describe the status of the capacity building across nations, determines as well the impact of capacity building when controlling for key contextual variables. So we do this study to analyze what is the impact of our variable CCS on different users' experiences. And moreover, we can explore the factors that are shaping the cybersecurity capacity in all these countries in the sample. So let me give you a bit of some figures from the paper regarding the status of cybersecurity capacity across the countries in the sample. In average, these countries have a low maturity stage. And for example, here you can see in this histogram that 58 countries out of 73 have a CCS, so this cybersecurity capacity scale, lower than 2, that we consider that is a formative level. So this is one first description of the data. However, you can see that the range of this variable is quite wide, and it goes from 1.03 to 3.28, which give us some variability to answer our research question. And this would be our model to analyze. So regarding the impact of capacity building, we estimate the impact of a cybersecurity capacity scale on different end user experiences. So the literature so far has focused a lot on the negative experiences, such as the encounter rates and the piracy rates. So we have as well this analysis, and moreover, we add the impact of cybersecurity on positive experiences of users. And here we have some descriptions. So we look at the vitality of ICT usage by businesses, governments, and individuals, as well as perception of freedom by the citizens, that is this voice and accountability variable. And to do so, we control by key variables. It's not just a cybersecurity capacity scale. We control as well by the size of the internet in the country, by the number, by the number of users in internet users in that country. That would be the scale variable. We use as well the percentage of internet users in the country. That would be the centrality variable. And the wealth of the country, that is, we approximate it by the GDP per capita in those countries. Well, so that would be, let's say, the right hand of the model, and the left hand is the how we use these variables to explain as well cybersecurity capacity scale, as we want to study as well the role of these determinants in shaping the maturity capacity in countries. To do so, we consider two different statistical models, the path analysis and the linear regressions, and both methodologies are consistent in their results. So here we can go to the blue part of this slide. That would be the results. So we find out that higher levels of maturity translate into positive outcomes for nations, particularly for encouraging the ICT usage across the different actors I was explaining. So government, users, and businesses. As well, the CCS as well increased the perception of citizens' freedom, and as well helps to reduce the rates of piracy. So we find that cybersecurity matters and has an impact on the experiences of users. We find as well that wealth is a very relevant factor shaping the national advances in capacity building, revealing a capacity divide between higher income countries and lower income countries. So I would like to show you this diagram where we can see that those countries with a higher GDP per capita are more likely to reach more mature stages in cybersecurity capacity. Those efforts that all these governments and institutions are doing then have an impact. And this study proves that there is an empirical support to international efforts aimed at building cybersecurity capacity. And it's not just that, our results as well help says that cybersecurity helps to mitigate a gap based on the wealth of nations. And yes, without any intervention, without these efforts that governments and international institutions are doing to build in cybersecurity capacity, this gap would grow with time. So here would be our main results. And I hope you could see everything that I show you. Thank you very much for your attention. And I would stop here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the very interesting and rich presentation. Thanks for all the panelists for doing a good job and also making it in time, being aware of time. We now move to the next stage of our event in which we have a discussant. So Carolina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amit. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. Cybersecurity governance has been a traditional concern of GigaNet, and in the past symposia we have seen always many panels and papers addressing the issue. So this space is a locus where we have developed some thought about the subject, and this year's symposium is not an exception. We are again seeing many different papers and approaches towards the issue. No? On the one hand, one could say that we are seeing how a problem that coming traditional scholars in internet governance, we have seen how governments and some other stakeholders' approaches to cybersecurity governance could put at risk some of the notions on internet governance more generally. And we see this work still being paramount in some of the papers we have seen. For example, Milton Mueller's and Karl Grindal's work is definitely addressing very profoundly, I mean, in the paper more than in the presentation, but there's more than 50% of the work is devoted to highlighting the very strong consequences of the contemporary actions of the U.S. government and how informational operations can have an impact on international internet governance. So on the one hand, we still see this kind of problems being addressed in our discipline, and this is exciting and also tantalizing, because we still have a lot of work of scholarly and from a policy perspective as well in terms of how this will evolve. And on the other hand, we are also contemplating how the cybersecurity domain, I mean, is also developing its own rules and trying to establish and consolidate its own institutions and processes. And so we are seeing this concerns coming from Stefania Grottola's work, coming from Rolf Weber's work, and examining also the challenges around measuring what does cyber capacity building mean in the work of Patricia Esteve-Gonzalez, Dutton et al. No? And so I would say that we have these kind of still two tensions in how we frame and we approach internet governance at GigaNet, and they should not be solved. I mean, I think this is a problem that might change internet governance as such and how we conceptualize it, but we are also seeing that internet governance already has its own disciplinary boundaries, rules, and ways of thinking about the problem that can also shape cybersecurity debates. So I have some very general and particular comments which I will raise, and then Amit will decide how to proceed in terms of the interventions of the panelists and the questions from the audience. But Stefania, you are addressing how the difficulty, I mean, in terms of solving the what you say and try to measure in a way in your work, which is the abundance of these cyber norms, and I think that you're actually capturing a point there in terms of the abundance of these cyber norms, but how does the abundance actually create tension for stakeholders in terms of moving forward? that is something I think you have a lot of potential in the work and to develop, and maybe you can tell us more how you're also thinking of continuing this research, as you mentioned, particularly during your work. This also ties in with, because Rolf's paper is also addressing in a way the problems that cybersecurity governance has in terms of the development, the norms, its norm development. And Rolf, I would be grateful if you could expand a little bit more on the notion of, you say that on the one hand, we have the legal instruments from international law and the law on international spaces on how to regulate cybersecurity governance, but then where are the challenges? And so here for like Stefania and Rolf, I see there's, one would say, okay, so we have a problem with the legal and normative instruments on the one hand, and Stefania is putting more emphasis on the institutional settings and how they work around that. So I think there's a way to think about the problem of why we have this proliferation and why we can't actually make cybersecurity governance more effective internationally with those two approaches. And then for Milton Mueller and Karl Grindal, I would like to know, I mean, knowing a little bit your scholarly background, and I'm going to use an institutionalist framework, but you say that 6 years ago, this was not the case. I mean, and this has changed dramatically as from 2016. Are we facing a critical juncture in terms of how cybersecurity governance and the changing of the information operations and its implications for IG, is this a critical juncture which will generate a path dependency, or do you think that a new government, as Amit was saying, okay, we are in the midst of a very important week for the United States and for global politics? I mean, is this a path, I mean, the beginning of a path dependency after all these 4 years of changes here? And here again, I understand and I adhere to the conflict and the argument around the blurring of lines between civil and military spaces. But what do you think? And this might seem as if I'm using transhumanist philosophy or some other kind of theoretical background, bringing this into this debate now. But when everything in the future will become more digital and we will all be more cyborgian in a way, how would you expect to maintain such clear distinction and lines in terms of how warfare is thought of and imagined when the blurring between the analog and the digital is more difficult to assess, and when everything actually will be crossed by the digital? And finally, for the work by Patricia Esteve-Gonzalez et al., I would I was not surprised to see the results of the survey. I mean, there's kind of this positive correlation that one would expect, of course. I mean, richer, more developed economies and countries have a stronger capacity, cybersecurity capacity, and digital capacities more generally. I mean, so this doesn't come as a surprise, but then this literature about capacity building, it excludes a little bit the preferences. So why would some states which have more restrictions, let's say politically or budgetary in particular, what would the work, the most relevant recommendation you think coming from your findings for these countries that have to make these very tough choices on, okay, I have to go through and invest more heavily in my cybersecurity capacity building, or otherwise I will not be a viable country? I mean, so what would be your recommendations coming out from your study? And those are my questions and my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I was thinking, giving some time to our participants to write some questions in the chat, and to formulate them, to use my right as a, as a chair to add another big question, continuing some of the things that were said here by Carolina. This is, speaking about cybersecurity in general, as an international global domain, I was wondering whether thinking about all the, the 4 papers we've presented here through a more international geostrategic lens might, cast light or supplement some of your arguments. And I'll give you an example. For Stefania, for example, you differentiate between, private entities initiative and states, but some states, like in the last case of the Paris Call, would work together with private sector initiatives, in order to, better their position in the world. France were working with Microsoft. Going to Milton and Karl's paper. So I was wondering whether, the greater tension between Russia and China and the United States is one of the main incentives to this, to 2016 being this threshold of pushing information operations. So what is the global context, between states that might push this agenda? For Rolf, knowing that China and Russia were one of the, the greatest advocates for a more use of, international legal framework to analyze cybersecurity incidents and to use it as a framework, might, what is that, causing to other states, Western states, to not adhere sometimes to some of the legal frameworks that you proposed, whether this international context is affecting that. And to Patricia Esteve-Gonzalez, capacity building sometimes being described as a present given from Western or the northern part of the world to global South, whether that's another, perspective that is affecting some of, that is behind in the background of what you're describing. So those are just examples, but in general, I would like to get your opinions on, the geostrategic context of your work. So I was thinking about waiting for some more questions. Let us start with each panelist addressing both Carolina's remarks and mine, and then we'll carry on. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start. I'm sorry, I lost the connection before, so I didn't really get your question, Amit, but I'll start with the Carolina's question. So you mentioned tension, and it doesn't, the abundance of cyber norms doesn't necessarily create tension, but it also does not necessarily help in moving forward with the norms. And so that's the major problem. And so if to a certain extent agreeing on the norms is relatively easy because they're not binding, and it's hard to make governments respect them, then it's the point is how can we actually gather all the stakeholders in a group, gather all the stakeholders in a room and try to actually discuss the norms rather than producing norms and norms and norms and then having the confusion that covers the big elephant in the room. And on the question of moving forward the paper, for sure, I would expand my data and the data collection and the data analysis, because of course, the stronger is the case that I bring with the paper, the stronger it will be the thesis that I advance. And then it would be interesting to actually, through qualitative methods, see if every actor proposing each set of norms will fit, for instance,
Stefania, you're cut off. We can't hear you.
Okay.
So you can go back again with some of the last few sentences.
Okay. So where were you? Okay, so I was saying, so in terms of moving forward with the paper, were you with me at that point? Okay, moving forward, expanding the data collection and the analysis, because the bigger it is, then the stronger is my thesis and the thesis that I advance, and then I can either confirm or reject the hypothesis that I advance. then it would be interesting to see if every actor proposing the norms then if it would be interesting to see whether they feel the new processes are needed. And this is interesting because usually this is somehow the private sector approach, but not necessarily the approach of civil society. And so it would be good to talk to them and actually ask them, so what do you think about this? Do you feel that you're not really represented? Do you feel that the multi-stakeholder consultations are just a set of statements that everybody does, and then we don't actually discuss the norms? And then it would be interesting to see whether they're actually willing to have a discussion with other set of actors that are proposing the norms, and that would be would actually try to justify or not proposal to have scientists, for instance, during the IGF, in which we gather all the proposals, we have all the people in the room, and then we propose a set of outcomes or just one outcome that then can be better discussed for government actors. And that's my point. Yeah, the last point about the policy architecture that needs to be in place is that if you have a lot of proposals, inevitably you don't really have a constructive discussion about that, and so we kind of need an umbrella sort of outcomes that gathers all the perspectives of different stakeholders. Then Amit, you have to remind me your question because I lost the connection and I had to get out and in again of the Zoom.
It's okay because actually we're getting closer to the end of the session. So if that's okay, let's move to Karl and Milton, and please try to be brief so we have enough time for everybody.
Thank you.
I'll just briefly.
Go ahead.
Briefly touching on the global context, I think there's both global technological trends of shifts in news consumption. The American media ecosystem is digital and international in a way that is very different. You also have these broad societal trends of increasing interstate rivalry as the US moves past a focus on non-state actors during the global war on terror phase. It's sort of within the security domain, it's redirecting its attention at national powers. And so I think you do have some underlying global trends that resonate with 2016 and probably accelerate that moment. Dr. Mueller?
Right, I wanted to address Carolina's question about whether this is something that would easily flip back to the status quo ante after the election, if Trump loses the election. And no, it's not really purely a Trumpian product, this new emphasis on information operations. In fact, the Russian, the Democrats have been banging on about the Russian threat and the disinformation operations even more than the Republicans. And I think it is not a done deal. The shift is still a little bit uncertain and contested within the US military because there are people who want to have a more close focus on war fighting, on information operations as a component of actual war fighting, where you're trying to disrupt the decision-making of the enemy. But that presumes you have an enemy, and it presumes you're at war. And one of the strange and possibly dangerous things about this broader concept of information warfare is that you don't have to be at war. And that means, well, who is your target? Well, it's potentially anybody, everywhere. And that means that the role of the state in sort of producing and selectively allowing information could be fundamentally changed in a way that's just inconsistent with the notion of a liberal democracy. So yeah, we probably don't have time for me to go on anymore, but that's a very interesting question in terms of how serious these shifts are, but there's definitely was a major shift in 2016, and it was driven more by the reaction to the Russian operations than it was by the election of Trump himself.
Thank you very much. It's excellent answers and questions. Let's move on to Rolf.
Thank you very much, Carolina and Amit, for the questions. Of course, the scope of the question is very broad, and if I would have to address the challenges in regulating cybersecurity in the context of internet governance, perhaps I should go a little bit back and look at history. Some 15 years ago, at the infancy stage of the IGF and of GigaNet, obviously we have discussed issues which were partly contested, but as long as we remain in the area of allocation of domain names or of regulation of business models, e-commerce platforms, etc., we do have somehow less impact from traditional governmental issues that we do have in the context of cybersecurity. And therefore, it's not really a surprise that we run into more tensions with cybersecurity. And as Milton has outlined, as soon as we look at cybersecurity, we are very close also to military interests. And I mentioned in my presentation Tallinn manual. So we are very, very close to the core of sovereignty of governments and of states, and this makes the whole exercise more cumbersome. In addition, again, history, the efforts over the last 5 years have shown that states and multilateral treaties are not able to overcome the problems. These treaties do not fly, not even in a draft form. So I have tried to look for other possible solutions in overcoming the challenges. And yeah, let's say those who know a couple of my publications are aware of the fact that I'm a friend, let's say like that, of the multi-stakeholder approach. However, by purpose, I have not mentioned multi-stakeholderism in my presentation because I think we do have additional qualities in the cyber security context, and for that reason I have pleaded for some kind of fructification of general legal standards which are basically accepted in other areas such as outer space, and I'm pleading for analogous application of these principles also in the cybersecurity area. I think I have to stop here for time reasons, but thank you very much. And just a last remark, of course, if we look at the geostrategic issues, let's say positive and negative perceptions taken by some states against other states also do play a role, and maybe can be seen as a special part of a sovereignty issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, we just have the time for a last answer by Patricia.
Thank you. Just to clarify that our work what does is, so the main contribution is to analyze the impact of cybersecurity on some outcomes. In our case, it's the user's experience. And we know that already, actually, in this conference from previous talks, we mentioned the cybersecurity or the technological divide between countries, and mainly driven by this wealth difference. But yeah, our main contribution is about the impact of cybersecurity on users' experiences, and as well with a new data set that hasn't been explored before. Yeah, regarding the geographic context, so the CMM, so the framework we use, tries to be objective from particular ideologies. We have several countries that they are, let's say, not democracies in the sample, and otherwise we wouldn't have this kind of interest by these countries. However, it is true that we all are influenced by the ideologies of these country leaders in capacity, and they are responsible on how we define some concepts of maturity in our model. Regarding the preferences, so we have a different paper that is focused on African countries. And we see that there is not a single pattern to achieve maturity. That is nice. And we actually see that, you know, our sample is very limited, but we see that there is some countries that they are more specialized in some particular dimensions. For example, dimension 4, some countries, they are very specialized in legal frameworks and laws in cybersecurity and regulations. But this doesn't seem to increase the cybersecurity of the rest of dimensions. So these countries doesn't seem to be particularly strong, while other countries that they specialize and they are more mature in, for example, the policies in cybersecurity and the strategy of the nation in cybersecurity, or in dimension 5 that is more related on standards and technical frame, the technical infrastructure. So these countries, they seem to be overall better, more mature in the rest of dimensions. And it's not just this type of countries. We have as well some other countries that they diversify and they invest their efforts in more than one dimensions, and they are doing, some of them are doing better than others, but we see some successful cases as well. So now it comes in mind, for example, some countries that they specialized in dimension 2 and 5, that these are the social dimension, social and cultural aspects of cybersecurity, and this more technical framework and more aspects related with standards and technology. Yeah, and I don't know if I have time, but there was a question on the chat about education and the skills needed. And so if I can answer very shortly that. So I think, yeah, thank you. There are some, so it's a very big topic. And so to say something shortly, I think it is very important to have some kind of supply of workers, of professionals in cybersecurity that gives a supply, a national supply, so the country doesn't have to go to a different country to find these experts that can teach people. And it's very important to train professionals and have educational programs in the nation to build these skills. And so it is as well very important to have standards. So the expectations that the firms are expecting from their workers that they hire meet with such skills that the workers have. So standardization of educational programs are very important. And finally, just to say that it is as well very important to have trained people and professionals in cybersecurity to design awareness raising programs, because this is not just about professionals in the IT department of businesses. This entails along a wide range of actors in the society. And yeah, so we need this available national supply of professionals in cybersecurity to educate the whole society, make sure everybody is aware of the risks of using the cyberspace and how they can, which practices they can use to reduce the number of cases of incidents and protect themselves.
I want to thank you. Thank you for a great answer. It's just the right time to wrap up. I want to thank the panelists for doing a great job, and especially for the wonderful papers you've submitted, presenting such rich, researches about this issue, which I strongly believe is a very current and pressing one. Last election, U.S. presidential election, cybersecurity was the third issue discussed in one of the debates. So it's definitely a central issue today, and I think it's important to discuss it, especially facing change in leadership, in world leadership, which is coming soon. So thank you so much. I want to thank Carolina also for the great comments, and for the participants, and for GigaNet for giving us a home to continue discussion on such an important issue. Hopefully this is just the beginning. Keep in touch and write and comment on each other. I think it's the right way to go forward. I know I learned a lot. So thank you very much.